Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating space, the exact spot where folklore, human psychology, and the flat-out unexplained all crash into each other. We are looking at the deeply unsettling history of inanimate objects that, well, seemingly take on a life of their own. And hey, whether you're a hardline skeptic or you're just deeply curious about this stuff, the documented footprints of these objects are absolutely captivating. So let's just get right into it. To really grasp the gravity of these claims, we've got to take a trip down to the East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. Now, inside this museum, sitting quietly inside a locked glass case is a doll, and the staff there enforces a very bizarre but very real rule. You absolutely must ask permission before taking a photograph of it. And no, they don't mean this as some fun, spooky tourist gimmick. They enforce this because, literally, the last time someone laughed it off and snapped a photo anyway, their life started unraveling almost immediately. And that's exactly what makes the physical footprint of this whole phenomenon so incredibly strange. Visitors who have actively mocked this doll or broken that photography rule. They've reported a sudden, inexplicable string of absolute misfortunes. We're talking severe, life-altering consequences here. Sudden car accidents, unexplained job losses, and relationships just destroyed in ways that make absolutely no logical sense. The sheer volume of this backlash has actually resulted in a massive, ever-growing pile of correspondence. Over the decades, hundreds and hundreds of letters have been sent to the museum. These are frantic, handwritten apologies, literally begging the doll to stop whatever it's doing to them. The museum actually keeps every single one of them, and guys, the pile just never stops growing. Now, you probably think that sounds completely insane, and honestly, most people do, right up until they actually stand in front of that locked glass case and feel this sudden pressure behind their eyes, or just an overwhelming, inexplicable urge to take a step back. Which brings us to Section 1, the science of fear, and why the room feels different at night. Now, before we look at the specific historical cases, we really need to ground ourselves scientifically, right? Researchers who study these types of objects always point out one key thing first. A room just feels different at night. During the day, an old doll is exactly what it looks like. Fabric, glass eyes, maybe some faded paint. But in the dead silence of the night, something shifts. You look at an object and your brain suddenly tells you its posture has changed, even though it obviously hasn't moved an inch. Well, science actually explains this through something called pareidolia. Basically, this is your brain's natural tendency to find faces and intentions in inanimate things. When you're just sitting there in the dark, your ancient nervous system, the exact same system that kept your ancestors alive in the wild for tens of thousands of years, it fires off this quiet little alarm. It's literally just your pattern recognition misfiring in the shadows, creating this incredibly visceral sensation that you are not alone in the room. So let's look at Section 2, our first case study, Robert the Doll. The thing is, pareidolia alone really struggles to explain the sheer longevity of this first major case. Back in the early 1900s, a young boy in Key West named Gene Otto received this large straw-stuffed doll from a servant who was very well versed in Bahamian folk traditions. Gene named the doll Robert. Now, Gene grew up, he got married, and he actually kept this doll all the way into adulthood. He even gave it its own room. When Gene passed away in 1974, Robert was finally locked up in the attic. But as you might guess, the story didn't end there. In the late 1970s, a brand new family moved into the house. Their 10-year-old daughter found Robert, and she claims the doll physically attacked her. And here's the kicker. To this day, as a fully grown adult, she completely maintains she wasn't just imagining things. Today, Robert is actually the very same doll we were just talking about, contained over at the East Martello Museum. But it's the specific escalating anomalies inside the Otto household that make this case so incredibly chilling. When Gene was just a little boy, his parents actually reported hearing two distinct voices coming from his closed bedroom. There was Gene's voice and then another, much lower, rougher voice. They would burst into the room to find heavy furniture completely overturned and little Gene pressed terrified against the wall, insisting with absolute certainty Robert did it. And his mother noted something really interesting. She said he said this with genuine relief, not at all like a kid just making up a quick excuse for a mess. And the phenomena didn't stop with the family either. Decades later, a plumber working on the house in the 1970s flat out refused to ever return. Why? Because he claimed he watched the doll actually change its facial expression the second his back was turned. No way, right? Moving right along to Section 3, our second case study, the real Annabelle. Now, if you know the name Annabelle, you are more than likely picturing the weathered, totally terrifying porcelain monster that Hollywood has popularized in the movies. But the reality? It's arguably much more unsettling. The real Annabelle is actually a soft fabric Raggedy Ann doll. Honestly, she's way less movie monster and much more grandma's sewing room. This totally normal-looking, almost sweet doll was given to a nursing student named Donna as a birthday gift back in 1970. And it really just proves that when it comes to documented historical anomalies, the source rarely actually looks the part. So how on earth does a plain Raggedy Ann doll become world infamous? Well, it started pretty subtly. Donna and her roommate Angie would come home to find the doll in entirely different positions, or sometimes even in completely different rooms from where they left it. Then it escalated. These unrecognized handwritten notes began appearing all around their apartment on tiny scraps of paper. They were written in this unsteady, childlike handwriting, and they simply read, "Help me" and "Help Lou." Now, Lou was a close friend of theirs who was already experiencing these terrifying bouts of sleep paralysis that somehow always involved the doll. But the whole thing truly peaked when Lou, while wide awake in the apartment, felt a sudden crushing pressure on his chest, completely blacked out, and then woke up to find fresh, bleeding scratch marks raked right across his torso. All of this very real physical evidence left behind ultimately led to the doll's current containment in Connecticut. The case was famously investigated by Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now listen, regardless of where you personally stand on the Warrens, the physical evidence here, along with the totally consistent testimonies of completely unconnected people, is thoroughly documented. A Catholic priest who actually handled the doll confirmed he felt strongly, without a doubt, that he was in the presence of something completely non-human. Today, Annabelle sits locked inside a wooden case in an occult museum, and she receives monthly blessings from a priest. Even so, visitors standing anywhere near her case frequently report sudden blinding migraines, terrible nausea, and this heavy, crushing feeling in their chests. In one super documented instance, a skeptic who actively mocked the doll by banging on her glass suffered a severe, horrific motorcycle accident on his drive home. He survived, but let's just say he never came back for a second visit. This takes us to Section 4, the unsettling truth, and the consistency across the decades. So it all boils down to the ultimate question, doesn't it? Is this all just psychology? We are really forced to weigh two very different realities against each other here. On the one hand, sure, we have the highly plausible, very scientific explanation of pareidolia and mass hysteria. It's just the human brain inventing meaning in empty spaces, right? But on the other hand, we have this massive trail of documented physical evidence. We're talking photographs, deep scratches, and severe inexplicable accidents. We really have to step back and ask ourselves if a simple misfire in pattern recognition can truly explain away multiple, totally unconnected people reporting the exact same physical phenomena year after year. Those who firmly believe these accounts point to a sensation that completely defies any clinical terms. They usually describe it as something older than psychology. When you really dive deep into the testimonies from people who have interacted with Robert or Annabelle, the most disturbing element isn't actually the physical scratches or the creepy notes or even the disembodied voices. It is the absolute consistency of the sensation they all describe. They report this very specific, terrible presence, like a tangible heavyweight in the room. It's that undeniable, skin-crawling feeling that something that has absolutely no right to look at you is watching you very, very carefully. Which brings us to a really fascinating conclusion when we put both sides side by side. We have the skeptics, completely armed with rational explanations like mass hysteria and the biology of the brain, and then we have the believers, who cite terrifying, first-hand experiences with a non-human presence. But despite having fundamentally different worldviews, both of these groups actually agree on one unifying fact, without exception. None of them, and I mean not the firmest, most dedicated believers, and not even the strictest academic skeptics who write papers debunking all of this, absolutely none of them would ever choose to keep one of these objects in their own home. There is a very real reason these museums keep these objects strictly behind glass, and a reason those cases stay permanently locked. We've explored the wild history, the strange physical evidence, and even the primal biology that makes the dark so terrifying for us. So I want to leave you with this one thought to take away from this explainer today. Tonight, when your house gets perfectly quiet, you are inevitably going to glance at some perfectly still object sitting over in the corner of your room, something that hasn't moved in months. And in that split second, you just have to ask yourself, what is looking at you?